And welcome everyone. I'm so excited for this panel to share a lot of their expertise and understanding and knowledge with all of you, and recognize that we've been incredibly fortunate to start the day with such a powerful discussion just now. And so we'll be moving into this panel about recreational impacts to ecological resources. And the focus of this panel is a set of ecological resources that were collaboratively identified as shared priorities across all the members of the Crown Managers Partnership over the course of many years, and that continue to be priorities in the Crown Managers Partnership's new strategic plan. So they include terrestrial invasive species, wildlife and connectivity, native salmonids, fire, and aquatic invasive species. So it's really a fascinating discussion that our presenters will be teeing up for all of you. And then we're looking forward to questions and discussions as we move into the broader Q&A at the end of the session. And so what we'd like to do is start with the questions that have been generated by the panel themselves to really address this big set of topics. And so what I'll do is start with perhaps just asking everyone to introduce themselves briefly, and then there will also be longer bios in the chat. Shall we start with you, Nanette?
Sure thing. I thought I'd go last since I was on the list last, but okay. Let's shake it.
I'm sorry. I just meant just to say hi and who you were, but it's okay. We can. I'll start again, and I'll switch it back to what the original order was. I apologize.
No. I can go. Do you want to give do you want me to give my 5-minute spiel or just?
Absolutely. Why don't we go ahead and start with that?
All right, sounds good. My name is Nanette Nelson. I am an economic researcher here at the Flathead Lake Biological Station, which is part of the University of Montana. So I'm at the, I guess, most southern end of the crown of the continent area. In the recent years, I have come into analyzing what the economic impacts of aquatic invasive species could be here in Montana. And I want to emphasize could be, because luckily for us, we do not have invasive mussels yet here in the state, although we did have a little brief scare there in 2016. But to date, we've done pretty well in intercepting boats and other watercraft carrying these invasive mussels as well as other species. And so my foray into this was a study that I did for the state back in 2018. And they wanted some estimates on the potential economic impact if zebra mussels were to successfully invade into the state. And so what I did for them is I identified various stakeholders that would be negatively impacted, and then estimated the mitigation costs for each of those different stakeholder groups. And to do that, looked at the literature. A lot of other places are experiencing these types of mitigation costs, and came up with some numbers for the state for them to use. Of relevance to this group was the impacts to recreation. And so my estimates were, for the state of Montana, we would be looking at anywhere from 36 to 122 million annually in costs from the successful invasion of zebra mussels. And for the Columbia River Basin specifically, it was around $15 to $48 million. And what those losses represent are the costs to boat owners from increased maintenance, and then lost revenue from tourism and recreational angling. And so those are fairly significant costs that we could foresee just for those zebra mussels, but we have other aquatic invasives as well, plants and fish, and those also have their own costs as well. And we would use different types of, I would use different types of techniques to try and get at those estimates. I could use actual purchasing behavior. So I could survey anglers about how much money they spent on a trip. And then I could ask them, well, how would your trips change if, you know, this invasive species came in and it changed your catch rate of your favorite fish? And that difference in number of trips could be then turned into a value for the benefit that those fish currently present, and also the benefit of preventing introduction of any other invasive species. I could also survey the general public and ask them for their willingness to pay for programs that reduce the probability of introduction. And so those types of numbers, those benefits could be used by managers to say, well, this is the losses we could be looking at in terms of benefits to the public or benefits to specific recreational users. And, you know, we believe these are significant enough to warrant investment in prevention. And indeed, with that, the numbers from my first study, that those numbers were brought before the Montana State Legislature to argue for continued funding of the Aquatic Invasive Species Program that is run by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So they do not have a permanent state line of funding. They have to go every 2 years and ask the legislature to keep funding them. And their amount, they get somewhere around $6 million a year. That represents only like 4 to 6% of the overall economic impacts if we had zebra mussels introduced into the state. So it's considerable. A very small investment for a very big prevention of costs. So in closing, my work, I feel I provide data to managers so that they can evaluate trade-offs of different courses of action. They can also use the data to plan for invasion, or they can use the data, like I said, to go argue for continued funding of their particular programs. So thank you.
Thank you, Nanette. And I'll go back to the original order now. And actually, it's a little bit of a nice segue having you start first, because we'll go from aquatic invasive species as the focus to terrestrial invasive species. And so I'm happy to turn it over to Kelly Cooley next.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks, Nanette. My thanks to the Crown Partnership for having this subject as the forum topic this year. I'm going to also launch into my sort of spiel, not so much about myself. I would say, for just a few words about me, you can read the bio that I've clipped into the chat if you want more details, but I've basically grown up in the Crown, was raised in the Crown, and both live and work and raise my own family in the Crown. So I would say the Crown is a professional and a personal interest, and it sustains myself and my family. So somewhat echoing what our presenters this morning said, we are part of it, and I do feel part of it. I definitely pushed the Crown managers a bit to talk about this issue, and the jurisdictional complexity of the Crown is one of the reasons this is such a thorny issue. And we know that visitation is increasing from the statistics from the national parks on both sides of the US-Canada border, but we don't have as good of an idea of the statistics elsewhere in the Crown, managed under different management regimes, but we know it's increasing. And, you know, we're moving from a situation where such as an issue such as invasive species, invasive plants, are not just in the front country and on the main roads, but increasingly with technology like e-bikes, that little child is going to grow up and go up with his grandparents to the tops of mountains, potentially causing issues all the way up and down, and not to mention invasive species. And we're seeing this across the Crown. This is not a new issue, obviously. A couple photos here from an old colleague of mine, Jeff Porter, that took these in 2004. And you just see, you know, we're loving the area to death with our recreation. I consider myself a recreationist, and so I'm careful always not to judge everyone else too harshly. And I know there are members within all the different groups that recreate very responsibly and take it very seriously. And I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush. But as these pictures show, not everyone is doing this. And we are making cuts in this landscape that are having not just short-term effects, but medium and long-term devastating effects. And it's hard to imagine. I think archaeologists in the future are going to take a look at some of this and think this was some sort of ritual suicide pact that we're doing by cutting into the landscape like we do. So, you know, we have to find a better balance. There's obviously impacts, both acute and chronic, from what we're doing. Things are increasing. We don't seem to really have a firm plan and a cohesive plan around the Crown to deal with this. And where we go, we take things with us. So our vehicles help transport the terrestrial invasives on grills and on underneath, you know, things that protect the workings of the vehicle get mud and seeds trapped. And our wheels bring things from one place to the next. And it's a chain reaction, an explosion in slow motion of invasive species like these hawkweeds here, oxeye daisy, common toadflax, spotted knapweed, many other species that are just spreading like wildfire. And the recreational impacts overlap with other things like industrial use, agricultural use, cattle coming in and out of public lands, and just the natural rhythms of the place, fires and floods. So what do? Well, there's lots of things we can do and have been doing, but we need to do more, and we need to do it more effectively. So the Crown Managers Partnership Invasive Plant Network has 3 times made this invasive plant book to help educate all people that visit the Crown, but even those who work in the Crown, as to what species are coming in or might be coming in. We need to do a better job of mapping, and this is something that experts can do, right down to the recreational hiker. They can use tools like EdMaps to help them map some of the things they see that shouldn't be there, so that they can be dealt with in a timely manner. And if you're interested in EdMaps as a free mapping software, there's a summit coming up on March 23rd. You can register through the North American Invasive Species Management Association website if you'd like to know more about it. We need to have local discussions, regional discussions, and international ones like we're having today about these issues, and talk about how we can start to do things on a more consistent basis. Signage is important. We need to put things out there so that people have it in their brain all the time that they're having an impact. And this is one that I really push, that you know, we have to go out where the people are recreating, and we have to make the issues that we're worried about real to them. So this is an event that happened several years back, where we actually set up a little tent city out in the staging area west of Pincher Creek in the east side of the Rockies, and set up a washing station so that quadders that happened to cross by could wash their equipment off themselves personally, and see what kind of seeds and other materials were coming off there. And all credit to this goes to Megan Evans, formerly of Alberta Parks, but now Executive Director of the Invasive Species Council in Alberta, for coming up with this idea, which I think should be an annual event and expanded to other parts of the Crown. It makes it real. It's really difficult to deny an issue when you're involved in and working with it firsthand, as this gentleman found out. His eyes were open. He didn't realize the invasive species he was driving through on and off trail were not only spreading within the area he loved, but we're going to spread back home where he lived and worked. And we need to make coming into areas and leaving them clean part of the ethic of being a recreationist. Cleaning off our vehicles. We need to consistently apply things like bike cleaning stations and boot cleaning stations across the Crown. Images like this make it very real for recreationists that take their pets or their horses with them, to see what something like houndstone can do to their pets, and that these are seeds that will spread to other areas. And we need to keep an ethic like this, cleaning your pets before and after, part of the ethic of being a recreationist. And, you know, promoting consistently these known concepts of maintaining hygienic equipment, having isolation for areas that are vulnerable to or detectable species are coming in, and then doing early detection and rapid response to deal with them as they come up. And this is some ideas I have. got a really inconsistent approach to how we have access to the crown. And is the pay-to-play approach feasible? This is just a concept. Some people are very much against the concept of fees, but I figure if you pay for something, you can take a little more ownership than it if you perceive it to be free. And it is, you know, there are issues involved with this, and I don't pretend that this is an easy solution, but it is one point of discussion. Obviously, Glacier Park and Kananaskis country just north of the crown are experimenting with different types of paths, and it's controversial, but I think it warrants discussion, further discussion. And so at a recent meeting with the Crown Managers Partnership leadership team, I threw this out again as a brainstorm, not as a hard idea, but all recreational impacts have impacts, I guess, on the environment. And we have to always remember that when we point a finger at one recreational group, there's 3 fingers pointing back at us, right? Just point your finger and you'll see that. So we have to be mindful of this, but I think it's fairly acceptable to say that foot traffic as compared to off-highway modified vehicle, there's a sliding scale of impact there. And so again, this is just an example, but perhaps a passport system where each cumulative recreation use you'd want to participate in comes with an increased cost. And again, the more cost, the more ownership is what I tend to think about it. And it's just a thought. It will be controversial to many and be outright rejected, but I think it's something we should give some idea to. And what would we use these for? Well, they couldn't just go into general revenue. They would have to help fund, you know, monitoring, maintenance and repairs, better design, enforcement, education, awareness, and presence park staffing. I think it's really important that we get more people out there to, as I showed in the Play Clean Go Day with the pop-up city type of thing, to meet recreationists where they're recreating. I think we need to go out there and be that uniformed officer walking the beat, or even an information officer that's there to just answer questions. I think this is a way to meet recreationists where they're recreating. And outside of that, as I wrap up, just wrapping up here, you know, what's the role of the partnership? Well, I think we need to talk about these things more than we have. We need to talk about when we do close or restrict activity and try and be more consistent, because if we're inconsistent in the crown, all we're going to be doing is relocating the abuse to other areas. So I think the consistency is something we should be striving for. And that's my opening remarks.
Thank you, Kelly. And now I'm really pleased to be turning it over to Kaitlyn Gaynor, who will be talking about the impacts of recreation on wildlife and connectivity.
Thanks so much, Anne, and thanks to the Crown Partnership for having me here. It's been really enlightening so far. I am currently a postdoctoral researcher in California. I'm at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and this summer I'll be moving up to BC to start at UBC as an assistant professor. And my research focuses on the impacts of human activity broadly, including recreation, on the behavior and ecology of large terrestrial mammals. And so in my work, I use a lot of motion activated wildlife camera traps, GPS telemetry, GIS analysis to understand the impacts of recreation on animal movement at landscape scales. And I'll admit, I'm an outsider to the Crown area. I grew up in New York, have been living in California for the last decade, and I've done a lot of field work in California and actually in sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of larger scale data science work. And so I'm really humbled by the invitation. I've just been kind of soaking it all in, and humbled by the deep knowledge that so many people who have really been living on this landscape for a while and working on it have. And so while I can't really speak too much to on-the-ground specifics related to wildlife in the Crown, I'm hoping we can also create some space for people to just kind of weigh in on the chat with their own experiences with wildlife and connectivity on the ground, so I can, you know, learn about how to do more management relevant research. I think something that's been highlighting for me is just the disconnect between the more academic research that we do and then really the needs of managers on the ground. And so, yeah, I guess just as a broad overview of the way we tend to think about impacts of recreation on wildlife. I think we often think about recreation as one of the most compatible land use types with wildlife conservation because it's transient, dispersed, and so our protected areas are often given this role of conserving biodiversity and facilitating wildlife connectivity, and also providing recreation opportunities. But as many in this forum have already highlighted in this panel also yesterday, there can be some significant adverse impacts of recreation on wildlife that can really add up cumulatively. And a global analysis led by Courtney Larson and colleagues a couple years ago found around the world recreation is linked to lower vertebrate species abundances and species richnesses. And some of these impacts can be pretty obvious and visible, direct mortality to wildlife species due to vehicle collisions, hunting as a form of recreation, euthanasia of problem animals, it's kind of just taking animals off of the landscape. We also see bottom-up impacts as well, which can be seen as potentially a benefit to animals that are being provisioned with human food or resource subsidies like minerals. But these subsidies can be problematic if they're creating conflict between humans and wildlife species, presenting risk to safety, property, disease transmission risk, and all of that. And a lot of other impacts we see mediated by what recreation leaves on the landscape, the creation of permanent infrastructure like roads can provide barriers to movement. Trails can provide conduits to movement at times, but also barriers if animals are avoiding highly used trails. And then just the habitat degradation, light pollution, noise pollution, water pollution that we kind of leave in our wake can compromise the health of wild animals, reproduction, survival. And then a lot of the research that I work on specifically is focused on the behavioral responses of animals to human presence due to just perceived risk associated with human activity and sensory stimuli associated with people. And this avoidance of recreation in all of its forms can lead to avoidance of prime habitat that can reduce the effective carrying capacity of an area for animals and also increase stress. And we also see other finer scale behavioral changes too. My colleagues and I documented widespread increases in nocturnal activity, for example, of large mammal species around the world in response to recreation, among other human impacts that we might be driving animals into the night with potential consequences for their survival, interactions with other species, and kind of role in the ecosystem. And then often we see like a lot of these different factors at play at the same time and complicated by species interaction. So for example, some work out of Glacier National Park that was led by Joel Berger and Wesley Sarmento a few years back looked at mountain goat use in relation to human activity. And it was a neat study. They found mountain goats were taking advantage of areas of high human use to use mineral deposits in the form of human urine, kind of pulling them off of their natural salt licks. And then also providing a refuge from grizzly bear predation because the grizzly bears were avoiding hikers. So we see a lot of these kind of impacts at play. And so, yeah, I guess we'll have more time to talk into it. My 5 minutes is probably up. But yeah, I'll turn it back over to Anne. Thanks.
Thank you. And so next we'll hear from Craig Johnson, who will be focusing on the recreation impacts to native salmonids. Craig?
Thanks, Anne. Are you able to hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect. And can I share my screen possibly?
Yep, you should have the ability to do that.
I have permission.
You've been granted permission.
I have to click all the buttons apparently for it to work. Give me a second here. Able to see that okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm Craig Johnson. I'm the currently working as the regional director for fish and wildlife in the southern part of Alberta, leading the fisheries and wildlife biologists, as they discharge their duties for fisheries and wildlife management. But included with that is recovery and restoration, focusing on species at risk. So we've got folks working on grizzly bears, sage grouse, and the topic of the day, native salmonids. I'm a fisheries biologist by training and experience. Been working on trout and native trout in Alberta for most of my career. And when I looked at how long that had been, it kind of surprised me. And I'd like to talk really quickly today, give a bit of an overview and talk about some of the complexity of native trout as it relates to recreation and, sort of in the context of the challenges we're facing. So I want to preface this with, and I really appreciated the comment earlier about the fingers pointing back at us. And, it's easy to point those fingers. I used to be a motocross guy. As a kid, I was one of those guys that liked to make the water fly and, wash my bike off in the stream. I've learned through time that that's not an appropriate thing, pretty quickly, actually, at 17. So we're all in this together, and we all have we're leaving a footprint. I'd in particular like to say thank you to the speakers this morning. I appreciate our co-presenters and the conversation we're having, but those presentations really resonated with me. And Mark, shout out to you in particular. What I'm about to present is that Western world view of native trout. And when the time's right, I'd like to talk a little more about what we're doing to communicate some of those things, and maybe how we need to expand and change. So I'll just go through this really quickly and talk about native trout in Alberta, and from the Alberta context. So it's a really busy place. The Crown's a busy place. Alberta native trout extends from north of Grand Prairie along the Continental Divide into up to the Montana border. Bull trout are top to bottom. This hatched line is Arctic grayling, Athabasca rainbows, the only rainbows endemic to Alberta. They're native to the province. And this orange gold colored area, or West Slope cutthroat trout. And this is a really narrow band of real estate in the province, and about 3.8 million of the human population in Alberta live within a 1.5 to 4 hour drive of this piece of real estate. And when we add those two things together, things get complicated for a lot of reasons, for native salmonids in particular. So I thought I'd do a little bit of therapy the other day, and I actually opened a book, and I thought, what is recreation? Like, how is that defined? And it's really the process of entertaining, or the pleasure, interest as a pastime, and how I'm trying to reflect on how that's affected and continues to affect native salmonids. So one of those things is sport fishing, and for sure we've been using the indigenous peoples that came before us used this resource, and continue to use the resource today. Fishing, angling, catching fish and using them isn't a new thing, but recreation is. And we started really early. This is 1902 on Trout Creek. It's a place I grew up hunting as a kid, and in the southern part of Alberta here, born and raised in the Crown, raising my family here as well. And I remember asking Dad, why do we call this Trout Creek? So I'd fished it for a bit and had never caught a trout. There are still a few West Slopes left. Used to be West Slope and bull trout present in abundance. And we still recreate today. I'm busy recreating, and in the Crown, this is a beautiful West Slope from the Elk River in British Columbia. This is not an unusual activity. There's a lot of pressure for recreation. We also took some interesting approaches very early, and we didn't actually discontinue the practice of stocking non-native trout over native populations until, the 80s, maybe 70s. And, we have this crazy love affair with rainbow trout as an example, or the belief that, in the day that a different fish would have been better. We stocked Yellowstone and coastal cutthroat over top of West Slopes in Alberta and elsewhere. And we went to great lengths to do it. We carried eyed eggs and milk cans over the divide to stock these high mountain lakes. And that's created a problem for, the sport fishing and over harvest way. And this stocking of non-native fish has created a problem with hybridization. And we're really challenged to deal with that. The most acute in Alberta is West Slope cutthroat trout, but brook trout and bull trout, or, I know we've grappled with that in Glacier with lake trout and bull trout, and the struggles with these, either the genetic competition or direct competition for resources, these non-native fish, has been a challenge. But it's important to note that recreation is part of a bigger picture of cumulative effects. It's not just recreation that are making sea declines or keeping fish in decline. There are a lot of different things happening on the landscape, and there's other things that we've heard about today, aquatic invasives. We could put whirling disease on this list or others. But the bottom line is we are as we start adding this up, we're starting to see declines like what we think our historic adult density of West-Slope cutthroat trout would have been. These are typical stoplight colors from good to less good, functionally extirpated and black, to what we think we're looking at today. And the challenge in front of us, remembering that map and the overlap of humans and this resource, is how do we reverse this trend and continuing to allow these kinds of things to occur? It's a I think fair to say, a wicked problem. So we've applied and continue to apply science to the problem, whether it's working with our colleagues in Montana on the genetics problem and how to tackle that on West-Slope cutthroat trout or bull trout. We're modeling, presenting papers in science, different science forums and conferences. But science isn't enough. We really need to work with our stakeholders, the people that are using the resource, and educate and increase that awareness with the people that are, well, in Alberta, that own these fish. It's not the government that owns them. And so just a bit of a spoiler for maybe later on, enter this group called Alberta's Native Trout. And this is the Alberta's Native Trout Partnership. I know there's some people on the call today that are part of this and active members. And certainly when the time is right, feel free to jump in on the chat and add your comments as well. But the government can't do it alone. We're doing this together. And so I'll talk more about this, from an education and awareness perspective, what we're doing to try to talk to those that are recreating and using the landscapes, whether it's ATVs and habitat damage, sedimentation, or angling, or the desires to fish. And we still have a strong pressure in Alberta and I'll use my dad as my ecological barometer. He doesn't understand why we'd want to go catch and release fishing someplace we can't catch just one fish. And what's the harm in it anyway, Craig? That the challenge of over harvest and angling effort and human population, it's a complicated situation. So I think with that, Anne, I'm just going to pause there for an intro and move on to.
Perfect. Thank you, Craig. And next we'll be moving on to Libby Metcalf, who will be talking about recreational impacts on fire.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, everyone can see my screen?
We can.
It's not like my notes pages, which I do like every lecture. Hi, y'all. I'm Libby Metcalf. I'm a faculty member in the College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana. I am the Joel Meyer Distinguished Professor of Wildland Recreation Management, which is a great title that I hold. And I'm just going to share a couple quick thoughts. I hope to stay within my 5 minutes here. But I just want to quickly acknowledge that what I'm going to present today is not just a brainchild of myself. It is part of a collaborative effort through the Joint Fire Science Program in collaboration with Montana State University, Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, and the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And so these are my collaborators, and it's important to acknowledge them. We know wildfire is a timely topic. And so I just put this up here because it's happening all over the world. And we're trying to figure out how do we best coexist, or how do we best tolerate, or how do we best think about wildfire in our lives. And so while my other panel members really talked about recreation use on the resource, I'm really going to focus on how fire impacts recreation use, because it's a slightly different, I think, angle than other folks have taken. And so when you think about this, so it has dramatic impacts for the Crown. It has dramatic impacts for all of the Western United States. And so how do we deal with that as a recreation entity? How do we deal with that as recreation managers? And so we have been working on this through our Joint Fire Science program and just trying to gauge that intimate connection between recreation and wildfire. This is a very basic bar graph. So if you're looking for my rigorous scientific work, this is not it. But this is, it's easy to read, right? And so this is a study that we conducted in Western Montana and in Washington. And so, and I use this just to illustrate this point that wildfire negatively impacts recreation opportunities. We know this to be true, right? So when you have wildfire in the landscape, it fundamentally shifts where people go and how they experience the natural resource. And so there is a big disturbance that happens with this. I like to think about wildfire and recreation not as two separate entities, but as this synergistic kind of interconnected component. And so one of the words we often use and we're hearing a lot about is this idea of resilience, or your capacity to kind of take a disturbance and then bounce back after that disturbance. And so there's a lot of framing in the literature that happens, but where I like to really go with it is this: when we think about wildfire and when we think about recreation together, we're really thinking about social ecological resilience, or the capacity to reorganize and adapt through multi-scale interactions between social and ecological components of the system. This is a really important definition because it suggests that the humans, the recreation, and the natural system both have to jointly work together to solve this wildfire challenge for ourselves. And so when you start thinking about that and you start thinking about what do we need to do, you can reframe your mind a little bit. So we've had a series of workshops through our grants to understand how people are thinking about resilience, in particular, people managers who are working on the ground. And so some of the folks on the call today might recognize some of these words and what I'm talking about because they may have been in the room with us. And so we've held a series of workshops to think about what are people really thinking about when we think about wildfire resilience. And what we often see emerge at the top is recreation opportunities and access. And so we know that people are thinking about all these other components. They're thinking about quality of life. They're thinking about biodiversity. They're thinking about firefighter safety. But what really emerges as one of the central challenges with wildfire is how do we create these recreation opportunities for folks? And I'm going to talk about these opportunities in a little bit more detail, but I just wanted to kind of share a couple little findings that we had from one of our managers' workshops that happened, I believe, in 2018, and we had it here in Missoula. And we brought folks from the Crown down. We brought folks from Washington over, and we tried to uncover what is it about recreation and fire. One of the first things we know is that we have to do a better job of describing the benefits of fire for recreation. And so my morale hunters are like their ears are kind of popping up because there are a lot of benefits. There's benefits for hunting, there's benefits for foraging, for trails, for backcountry use. We also have to acknowledge the relationships and partnerships that are needed in place. And I heard this from my previous speakers on this panel, all talking about how we need to work collectively and collaboratively to help coordinate across these wildfire events. We also know that there's an increased communication and coordination among partners that's needed. Wildfire does not just happen in Glacier, it happens in the area, it happens in the Crown, and it affects every component of the Crown of the continent together. And so that coordination among partners is going to be critical. And then there's the last part that emerges, this need to assist and help recreationists by the type of opportunities they want while wildfire is happening. I have the picture of the 2018 fires from Glacier National Park up here. When those fires occurred, it dumped recreation users and all these other components of the recreation landscape. And so how do we help and assist those recreationists find those opportunities that they want so they can still have the experiences that they seek? And so with that, I will stop and I will turn it back over to Anne.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So now what we'll do is start tackling the questions that we have identified as sort of fleshing out more of the details around this discussion. And so the first one is and I realize many of the panelists have already started to address this question, but if you'd like to add more details, that would be very welcome. And so how does recreation affect the conservation priority topic that you have the most expertise on, whether it's fish or fire or wildlife? And if it's helpful, please explain what you mean when you say recreation user. Panelists?
I can start if you're not going to put us in an order. I guess the last thing first, the recreation user or recreationist is not really a monotypic descriptor. There's a huge difference between different types of disturbances, whether they're on foot or horses or up to, mechanized, motorized transport, but all have the ability to transport terrestrial invasives, some more than others. Terrestrial invasive species seeds and the reproductive root fragments, in the case of some species, can be introduced and spread by recreationists, both into the crown from areas previously that they visited, and then out of the crown to wherever they go next, quite frankly, whether that's work, home, or another recreational opportunity. And there's various vectors that harbor these invasive propagules, which include everything from your boot laces, treads, your Velcro tabs, zippers, clothing, gear, and equipment, and even garbage left behind. On vehicles and trailers, you have wheels, spokes, undercarriages, interiors, and cargo areas that can carry them. And on pets and particularly horses, on their hide and their mane and tails, and even in the case of horses in their feed, you can have invasive reproductive materials in those as well. And even if recreationists are carrying these terrestrial invasive propagules in disturbed areas, such as the Waterton town site or Apgar Village or parking lots or staging areas, they can still drop those seeds and whatnot to establish nursery infestations that are going to establish in these well-traveled areas of higher disturbance, and then leave seed sources for other people and their equipment, local wildlife to transport them as they venture deeper into front country trails, lake shores, creek banks, and even remote backcountry areas. And that's how new infestations develop along both natural and linear disturbances in the crown. So those in turn can also be picked up by wildlife recreationalists and even trail maintenance workers to again be spread further into new areas. So they can also even be spread by natural wind and water runoff. Thus they infest ephemeral, seasonal, and even permanent watercourses. So you see this chain reaction that happens from just something very simple. And then, as Libby was pointing out, after catastrophic fire or flood events occur, that causes even more disturbance, opens up the canopy adjacent to those trails and, against some of these water features. And these little invasive microcolonies that don't look like such a big deal, all of a sudden have a lot more opportunity to spread out for outward from those sites. So it quite literally is an explosion in slow motion. And it's something we do need to get a handle on.
Thank you, Kelly. And then I see that Mike, you have your hand raised. I wasn't sure if you had a clarifying question or.
Oh, no, I just had a question for Craig Johnson on the Westbrook cutthroat trout. The trouble we had with mountaintop coal mining and selenium getting into the upper Old Man areas and what that would have put the population of that fish to. As we know, in the Fording River in British Columbia, I think it was 93% of the Westbrook cutthroat trout were gone. Would that have had the same effect in these rivers in southern Alberta? And we're a part of the fight against coal mines and successfully beat it. So now it's been law again. For how long, we don't know, but there will be no coal mining in the future in these areas. So that might put our children in the future to fight that battle again. So just a little comment on that. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Mike. That was a great question. In my slide of cumulative effects, stressors that I blew over, there was a photo of a mountain mine, and selenium is certainly one of those stressors that we include in our modeling, the trying to understand where the what the key drivers are, but it's complicated. In the crow's nest system, for example, we have coal mines, whirling disease, recreational angling, and the other suite of things. So disentangling some of these things is really difficult, but selenium is a topic that's it's certainly up on our list of important stressors to be considered. So great question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mike. And I'm wondering if other panel members had additional comments that they wanted to throw into the mix about how recreation is affecting the conservation priority topic that you have expertise on, or to talk about ways that you may be defining recreation user that may be different from the way that Kelly described it.
Anna, you okay if I just keep rolling?
Sure, yep.
So for me, and I think our group, a recreation user, it's certainly any human looking to conduct some kind of leisure activity. And we're really trying not to focus traditionally recreation was, from a fish perspective, was anglers and angling. But we know now there's lots of direct and indirect connections that occur. So really broad in how we're considering the user. A couple of other comments and maybe a segue from that. I presented sort of static boxes of categories of things on that slide, but they're certainly interrelated. The same humans that are coming to the landscape to camp or use motorized vehicles may be doing that so they can engage in an activity like angling. So things are compounding and working synergistically from a fish perspective, I think. I'd also like to talk a little bit, or just to raise the point further to Kelly's talking about aquatic invasive species, and whirling disease. I just mentioned that in my response to Mike's question, is an issue for native trout, and we have it in southern Alberta. We don't know how long we've had it. We discovered it in 2016, but that's certainly another issue, and a disease that can travel, an invasive that can travel with on vehicles, just like Kelly was talking about. And then the last point I'd like to make is, so we talk about sport fishing and mortality, and it seems intuitive that mortality would be if we have a bag limit of fish and allow harvest. And in Alberta, we don't, where there's native trout, it is strictly catch and release. But we do recognize that release mortality occurs when fish are caught and released. And while the proportional, the relative release mortality is low, the absolute number can be high when angling heiford's high. Remembering my map and graph, or the drawing showing the overlap of humans and fish. And we're also concerned about how that may increase during this, when we're running into these periods of low and warm flows and climate change and drought and what that means. So it's a concern for us that maybe even our most restrictive regulations, catch and release, may not be enough to meet our objectives. So it's something that we're keeping our eye on there. Thanks.
Love to hear from Nanette and Kaitlyn on their thoughts, and maybe help us segue into that next question.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, just to echo what Kelly said and others have said already, I think it's important to think about recreation not as a monolith, but also in the context of wildlife, not to think of wildlife as a monolith either. And so there are going to be interactions between, species traits and their sensitivity to different forms of disturbance, and then also the different forms of recreation and kind of the sensory stimuli associated with those forms of recreation, their impacts on the landscape and all of that. So I think a lot of what my research is trying to understand is what those links are and how relative vulnerability of different species might be kind of reshuffling community composition and ecosystems with implications for ecological functioning and kind of downstream consequences. And I also just wanted to I also want to hear from Nanette. I'll toss it over to her, but if others have in the chat, I'm really curious from land managers in the Crown, what you guys see as the most salient kind of issues involving wildlife and recreation and in the systems where you're working and managing and living, just to kind of crowdsource some ideas, even make connections between people having similar wildlife issues. So I also want to open the floor in the chat to other people, also selfishly really curious to learn more. But yeah, Nanette, maybe speak to invasives.
Thanks, Kaitlyn. Don't be shy about pitching new research ideas. I think that's great. So, I mean, from work from others, it's clear that invasive species, aquatic invasives and terrestrial invasives are correlated with how many people come and visit an area, and it's a positive feedback loop. So the more pristine an area is, the more people get attracted to it, as we heard yesterday in the talks, that people want those iconic shots, you know, social media, whatever. And they show up and are not really aware of their potential as a vector for introduction. And so I think there are some user groups that have more awareness than others, thanks to these inspection stations we have for watercraft. They intercept folks moving watercraft from one location to another and check their boats. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of users out there that don't think their particular watercraft really qualifies. And yesterday, Wade Freeman put out some stats on new recreational or purchases, and I was blown away that stand-up paddle boards have increased 82% in the last 12 months. So we have a lot of people getting more watercraft to go out into these beautiful places and can be potential vectors. So it's tough, and I just want to throw this out there, but maybe there's an opportunity here for either the makers of these pieces of equipment or the sellers of these pieces of equipment could educate the buyers as they're, you know, in the store shopping, to become aware of what they are in terms of a vector of introduction. And you know, this happened with angling. So if you wear stream angling boots, they no longer make those boots with the felt bottoms, because they realized that they were transmitting invasives from one stream to another. So I mean, there is opportunity there on the consumption side to get education into people's recreational behavior.
Some great examples, Nanette. Thank you so much. And Libby, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. I think this is a great conversation, and to kind of some of the Nanette's points. When we think about invasives, when we think about all these activities, we often think about them as like this seasonal thing that we have to address. And we do this with wildfire too. We think it's just, we have wildfire season and we have to address the challenge during the month of July and August. And one of the reframing that we're doing around wildfire right now is that it's a year-long phenomenon. This is not something that just comes off your plate just because it's not the summertime. And so as we think about kind of wildfire, invasives, wildlife, it has to be a constant conversation throughout the year, and it follows some natural flows and cycles, but that's a critical component of it. The last thing I just want to note is that the recreation impacts on wildfire are smaller. Wildfire impacts on recreation are bigger, and so we can get into that second half. But I do want to acknowledge the role of personal ignitions, fireworks, some of those kind of summer activities that often impact wildfire events. There was a big push last year across Montana to kind of stop the stop fireworks. I don't think we were that successful. And so, but I just want to acknowledge that component. And the last thing is, we know fire moves dramatically, or can move dramatically across landscapes. And so I use the Glacier 2018 fires as a great example. And so when we have that dramatic fire movement, it has a really big impact on recreation on the ground. And so we can dive into that as we move on.
Terrific. And just keeping my eye on the clock, I'm thinking it might be helpful to engage on the next question, because it's a pretty interesting one and the focus of a lot of the comments already today. And that's, how can we most effectively coordinate the management of recreation across the Crown? And how is your own work helping to support these goals, if that's something that you're engaged in already? I'm not sure who might like to go first. Oh.
Sorry about that. I'll let someone else.
Sure.
I'll jump in. So I think that they're in the Pacific Northwest, because it is the last remaining major river basin. The Columbia River Basin is the last one that does not have zebra or quagga mussels. There was this really, when they saw them in Montana, there was this tremendous effort for state and federal agencies, both in the States and in Canada, to come together and get on the same page about prevention, and then prevention and early detection. And as course, they shifted millions of dollars towards this effort. And so I think it's a good example of how, when minds come together, that they can really address issues, and how important it is for all the different agencies to get on the same page. So they're delivering the same message. That's really important for the public to hear the same thing, I think, over and over, instead of slightly different messaging programs that we've seen in the past. And also, I think it allows for efficiencies, so that not just one state is up, being the place where they're trying to stop everything, but states collectively are trying to work on this, or provinces, and trying to prevent the spread of these. And so I think that we could probably take a page out of that book and that effort on zebra and quagga, and apply that to all kinds of invasives, but also into just management in general. And just and I heard yesterday several times that people, the managers, were collectively working on things. And the first speaker, Wade and Freeman, talked about that down in the Southwest, so that when one area is managed for, there's just not this big spillover into the areas that are not managed, but it's a collective, and therefore, it's not leaving one place overly protected and the other ones like open, like to just be run over by being displaced.
Thank you, Nanette. And Mike, I see your hands up again.
Thank you. I just have a comment in regards to the treaty right to hunt, fish, and gather, and the recreational areas here, the trails that are going to be used. How was that taken into consideration, or will it be taken into consideration, the impacts of that for native populations, treaty nations that will be in these areas hunting for sustenance and not recreational hunting? This sort of activity was introduced in the Castle mountain areas in southern Alberta, and it pushed our people further up on the mountain. And then you have the recreational use areas introduced as well, pushing our people even further, and the potential of mountaintop coal mining came in. So it was sort of thought of as an afterthought and dealt with last, but I think we can work, if possible, to address these before it gets out of hand, because people are going to ask questions. How was this handled? Who did this? Who did what? Those sorts of things are what the communities ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike and Nanette, for your comments. I think, as I mentioned in my opening comments, that inconsistency of recreation management within the jurisdictional soup that is the Crown needs to be addressed, and it's not easy to make harmonized protection from recreational activity and loving the Crown to death. The dialogue has to occur at multiple levels between area managers, and that's public, private, non-governmental, local, regional, interprovincial, and international discussions have to be ongoing. And the goal has to be understanding the scope of the issue and finding consistent approaches wherever that's possible. And I think there also needs to be a recognition from those who profit directly from recreation that failure to manage it with a long-term conservation view risks killing the goose that lays the golden eggs from a financial point of view. Recreationists and the groups that represent them have to recognize that everyone is part of the issue and potentially part of the solution. So more mindful approaches are vital. This might mean seasonal limitations, closures, or restrictions to one or more recreation sectors as conditions warrant. And I think we have to be sensitive to that. the pandemic was a unique opportunity to see what happens when people can't recreate elsewhere. What did they do? They recreated close to home, and we saw visitation spike in the Crown like never before. In terms of my own work, involved with working with Crown stakeholders on an ongoing basis, that's managers, staff, and the general public, to better understand the potential impacts of unchecked recreation with regards to the potential to introduce and spread invasives. That's my main area. And also to help them implement proven strategies of prevention, early detection, rapid response to new invasions, integrated control of existing infestations, and mindful reclamation of disturbances. My work also involves partnerships such as this one, the Crown Managers Partnership and its Crown Invasive Plant Network, the Southwest Invasive Managers here in Alberta, and promotion of, again, invasive species prevention and management tools and programs that are hosted by the Alberta Invasive Species Council and the North American Invasive Species Management Association. And those include things, like I said in my opening remarks, ed maps for mapping invasives, play clean go strategies across the Crown, the guidebook that the Crown has produced 3 times, and concepts like weed-free forage and gravel materials being used in the Crown.
Thank you, Kelly. And I see lots of great comments and back and forth and questions in response to Kaitlyn's question to everyone. So please keep those coming. That's really exciting to see. And then Jack, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yes, am I unmuted?
You
Can
are.
you hear me? Whoa,
I can.
I got lucky. I just have a couple comments having listened all morning. First of all, it was really disheartening to hear about the interaction between some of the Indigenous peoples and guided recreation. For me, that's an unacceptable behavior. And I would encourage those agencies that administer permit authority for guided recreation to continue to look for ways to raise the bar, to make permitted use the role model of how you do it right, whether it's socially or culturally or ecologically, continue to make that happen. And I think there's an opportunity to do that. And in some cases, permit administrators just kind of look at it as an evil that they have to tolerate. And I'd like to see that attitude change to where you embrace the opportunity for guided recreation to not only be the role model of good stewardship, but also be the educators to help those people without skills and equipment to learn. And secondly, I'd like to see, there's been a lot of discussion this morning about the negative impacts, and I'd like to turn that a little bit and say, let's figure out how to use some carrots to reward positive experiences and look for ways of, rather than reduce, restrict, eliminate, regulate, figure out ways to encourage people to do the right thing, to incentivize them to do it right, and never lose sight of that and say the only answer is to regulate, restrict, reduce, etc. So those are just some comments after hearing this morning. I really appreciate all of the valuable information that the presenters gave this morning. It was very enlightening and educational to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. And I'd invite the rest of the panel who hasn't already commented to either address some of those points that Mike and Jack have just raised, or to, in a larger context again, to revisit how we could most effectively coordinate management of recreation across the Crown within this larger conversation and with the comments that are being shared. Are there others who wanted to say anything?
Yeah, I was going to come back to that bigger
Great.
initial question you asked about,
Great.
coordination. I think in the context of when we're thinking about wildlife connectivity, I think we have to be thinking at kind of larger landscape scales. And there are, I know the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative has the Crown as one of its important focal areas. So there are efforts to coordinate that kind of larger scale connectivity, in addition to thinking at kind of smaller scale management within parks. So just wanted to give a shout out to efforts, like Yellowstone to Yukon, also the Crown Management Partnership, in thinking about connectivity planning. But the importance not just of creating big maps of all of these protected areas linked together, but really understand what's going on inside the protected areas and what kind of barriers to movement might be impeding that large scale connectivity you see on the map.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. And I see Libby, you've come off mute.
Yeah, Kaitlyn, I think love that idea, because one of the things we know about like wildfire is when wildfire exists on the landscape, it dumps people into other places. And one thing we don't have a really good grasp of is what are our recreation assets across boundaries? And so how do we think about these just mapping recreation? We have them for the Forest Service, we have it for the Park Service, we have it for these individual entities. And so how do we create that kind of more kind of holistic picture of what the recreation landscape actually looks like? I like Jack's point about outfitter and guides, and how do we think about these kind of efforts and concessionaires as we progress through recreation. And we know wildfire has a significant impact on those economies, and we have these permitting systems for outfitter guides that might need to be adjusted and altered as we think about how wildfire moves through time. And so one of the places where we often go is, how do we start those conversations? This room is a great place for that conversation, but sometimes it even needs to start at a smaller scale. And we heard this over and over, and I see Mary on the call, but you know, one of the things that has been seen as a success is Glacier National Park having coffee in Columbia Falls each week, and sitting down and talking to anyone who comes into the diner to have a conversation. And so I challenge us to kind of think about these very formal mechanisms for having dialogue and debate, but also thinking about the easy one-on-one and just moving beyond your boundaries and having a conversation in a very informal way. Yeah, I think I'll turn it over maybe to Craig or Nanette.
I'll jump in for just a second. I just wanted to build on a bunch of the other great comments that we've heard. I think, you know, how do we coordinate the management of recreation across the Crown? You know, we're all in our individual jurisdictions, so that, you know, actual management may be more complicated. But, you know, Nanette talked about the great campaign on aquatic invasives and how we got together, you know, across state, provincial, and international boundaries. And I was thinking about that, you know, our stakeholders. I showed you a picture earlier of me holding a West Slope cutthroat trout from British Columbia, and I'm a native of Southern Alberta. We recreate at the scale of the Crown, and having a consistent message or way we're describing, communicating some of those management intents concerns, or like Jack talked about, the, you know, how do we incentivize, how do we encourage other people to make those good choices, might be a real good place to start. The users are part of the solution here, not just the issue. I like the idea of flipping this coin over and looking at it from a positive lens. Thanks.
Great, terrific. Thank you. Well, I think maybe we'll, if the panel's okay with it, we'll move on to the next question. And that one's also a really super sort of interesting one to contemplate. And I'm really glad that it's one that you're all going to speak to now, because it's really asking how you engage with people recreating on the landscape while monitoring specific resources or conducting studies. And then when you do encounter people, how are you trying to communicate with them in an effective way about the impacts of recreation, to get back to this idea of educating the public and people who are the recreational users. So I'm not sure who might like to start first.
I think that it's absolutely critical to go to where the recreationists are and not expect them to come to us as managers. I think we have to meet them where they're recreating. And that can be anything from one-on-one conversations to small groups to larger gatherings, but we have to go where they are. Traditional and social media messaging on an ongoing basis and engaging significant influencers in each of those media types, I think is very critical, especially with reaching younger recreationists. I think we really need to be more savvy than we have been about utilizing influencers in those media. Road and trail signage, pamphlets and handouts, and continual reminders to do things like, in my sphere, Play Clean Go. Public and private meetings of recreationists, like, again, try and find ourselves as managers ways to get invited to their gatherings and their discussions, and bring with us presentations or simple table displays. I think more of that needs to be done. And you know, when trails are established, whether that's by an agency or by a user group, making ourselves involved in that process to make sure they're done, not just from a regulatory point of view, but in the goal of understanding what the recreationists want out of their trails versus what the conservation values are. So being involved with that from even the conceptual stage, I think is very critical. And then, as I mentioned, with what Megan Evans did with the Play Clean Go Day in the backcountry, having these pop-up events that can intercept people as they're recreating and just have discussions, not be heavy-handed, but just have discussions, I think helps with the engagement and builds trust and cooperation and collaboration.
Thanks. Go ahead, Kaitlyn.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, you know, in many cases, like Craig said, you know, washing is vehicle in the river, sometimes people just don't know, right? And so education is of course important, how to securely store your food so that bears can't get into it, but then also why that matters, you know, that a fed bear is a dead bear, and kind of like linking those actions to the outcomes that they're preventing. But something I don't know, maybe the other panelists have thoughts on, is like when people actually do know maybe why they shouldn't be doing it, but they just don't care, or they still want to do it anyway. Like the incentive to kind of take your car out where no one's been before is too great because you can have a lake to yourself. What do we do then? And like, what's the role of enforcement relative to education and in balancing these impacts? And, you know, do we need both? And I'm not a manager, so it's easier for me to say like, you know, do it all, but I know it's more complicated than that. There's a lot of different interests at play.
That's a great question. And I have an answer to that in my response to the last question. So good point.
Others?
Yeah, it's Craig here. Do you mind if I share my screen again really quickly?
Go ahead.
Awesome. So I talked about earlier about Alberta's native trout and the collaborative. So I'm really going to speak at this from what our group, and none of this is my material, and this isn't actually Government of Alberta material, which is awesome. We formed the Alberta Native Trout Collaborative or Partnership. Government can't do this alone. We need support and help from others. And that team has got a team that's really working on the communication education, the communication collaborative, and really looking to talk about those things we just discussed. How do we bring that message to the people that are using the resource where they're at? And I think they've done an amazing job. This is a sort of a group or an image of the partners that are involved, and you know, whether it's financial or, you know, rolling up their sleeves to create the messaging and this approach. And the graphics that we're seeing here are generated by this group. So a communication strategy, they're doing ongoing surveys to understand attitudes and you know, why are people, to Kaitlyn's comment, you know, when they I know our cows and fish partners, once upon a time, they would put a sign up on a bridge, and it wasn't legally mandated that you needed to use the bridge, but the education, and some people would and some people wouldn't, and they would drive in the stream and understand what's happening. Focus groups, the research is how are the attitudes changing. So they have a very detailed and I would say aggressive communication strategy and campaign, you know, reaching out on social media, going to trade shows. They are planning sessions with ATV groups at staging areas in the East Slopes in Alberta. So really doing what we're talking about doing. I'll drop a link to this website in the chat. You can take a look at it at your leisure, but it's a really cool website. Very simple. You can click and dig through.
Craig, I don't mean to interrupt, but did you mean to be sharing your screen right now?
Oh yeah, am I not
seeing anything?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, you have to click the green
Oh,
box.
I click all the buttons again.
There you go.
Oh, but I wasn't on mute.
No, we heard you.
No, we heard you.
That is so terrible. So the words are okay. Here's the image of the partners. My apologies, everybody. That was terrible. And the words I just talked about, the work that they're doing. This is the sort of the infographics that some of them that the group has developed, and I'll drop a link to this website in the chat. You can take a look. It's a really great website that you can explore the details on the native fish in Alberta, what is habitat, above and below water and why it matters to fish. And then you can dig into some of the things that affect fish: recreation, camping, ATVs, angling, and those kinds of things. I think they've done an amazing job, and yeah, certainly tooting their horn, not mine at all. This has been a lot of heavy lifting by the partnership that's been working with us to get these messages out there. Super cool stuff. I'm very excited about this, and I'll throw these links in the side chat for folks. Some examples of things we have on YouTube or the Bow Habitat Station, some of the Facebook posts that are happening. So that's a little bit of what we're up to in terms of sharing not just my screen, but the message with the recreational users. Sorry about that. That was a terrible technical faux pas.
Oh, no, it's all good. And Todd, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks. Hey everyone. Nice to see everyone here. I'm Todd. I work for the Ministry of Forests in British Columbia. I work with both the range program and the habitat program. And this is an awesome forum conference. Nice to see people and learn more about it. And I've got more things to do beyond here, but kind of a bit of a case study I want to throw at everyone on this panel here on something that I'm working on with work right now in terms of we receive Crown land applications from proponents that would like to have different uses on Crown land, and there's one trail proposal in the Upper Elk Valley, so just west of the Alberta border in the Rockies there. And it seems like a very simple proposal of just a loop trail system that'll be used for multi-use, and they hit all the buzzwords and everything. But I'm just wondering about like how we can assess the cumulative effects, and I guess if there's best practices, or like when is the trail density too high, or is it good to concentrate all the trails in one spot as opposed to branching out? But yeah, so the proposal would be for an 8-kilometer loop trail up a valley that only has one other trail for Nordic skiing, which only allows Nordic skiing, but so they want to have a fat bike trail that will have you can snowshoe on it and hike there too, but then they'll have the snow dog groomer that in a non-motorized zone, so then there's that noise there, then the maintenance in the summer and the winter. Not sure if dogs would be permitted in there, the impacts to aquatics with it being in the river, if there's there's just a lot of different impacts. And I've spoken with cumulative effects biologists and grizzly biologists and wildlife staff as well, and just trying to wrap our head around this. And I guess more, perhaps more to Kaitlyn on if you have any advice, or how we can kind of, because we're getting a lot more of these different commercial recreation applications for helicopter access, mountain biking, and just a lot of different things that haven't been around with the e-bikes and different things like that. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out how we can not have this death by 1,000 cuts. And yeah, that's where I'll leave it with that.
That's a great point. I mean, I can't speak to what to do about it, but I do know that, that recreation is tending towards more and more impactful, right? Like as technology improves and all these new ways of getting out and into the backcountry, we're definitely seeing a trend towards more impactful recreation rather than less. So yeah, I mean, I think understanding the spatial distribution of where your most vulnerable resources are and trying to restrict and plan accordingly. But there's only so much you can do with limited information and a really, really rapid change in the recreation dynamics. So I don't know, kick that question to other people that know more about the management side of things. Keep weighing in on the chat too. There's great ideas in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question, Todd, and one that we grapple with, as we talk about what the existing evolved trail network looks like relative to the wildlife and fisheries values we're trying to manage for. And Brad Jones, I know, was on the call and presented either yesterday or the day before. He leads the recreation management team, and we're using linear thresholds and density values to try to manage from a wildlife perspective. It's a little more complicated for fish. It's less black and white, but really focusing our efforts about what do we do when we get adjacent to streams. So but there's no good recipe book for this. It's complicated. And everybody.
Thank you. And oh, sorry, go ahead, Craig. I didn't
No,
mean
no,
to cut
no,
you.
it's okay.
Yep, and I just wanted to touch base with Nanette as well, because we haven't heard from you in a bit. We're having a really lively conversation. So I wanted to ask if you had some specific things you wanted to throw in, given that, you know, especially communicating the impacts of recreation to those recreationalists who could really affect the introduction of aquatic invasive species is something that clearly you think about all the time.
All the time.
All the time.
Yeah, so, well, so there's a chat going on, and I'm wondering if, you know, we can't borrow from other common pool resource users and take a page out of their book in terms of, I'm thinking particularly about the lobstermen in Maine, who do a lot of self-policing, and in doing so, they have really great control of the resource, and so that it's productive. They see the connection between their livelihood and the health of the population of the lobster, right? And so it's a long-standing story, and it's developed over, you know, hundreds of years. But yet I think we could do something like that here, where we could give users, recreational users, some agency to talk to people when they see inappropriate uses, right? So not to engage people, you know, in their face, but just, you know, strike up a conversation and possibly give an educational moment. I'm thinking about that for the angling, or for the, you know, the cleaning off of vehicles, or when someone pulls their boat out of the at the boat ramp, you know, just saying, hey, did you perform your clean, drain, dry, or something like that? I don't know. But I think we all have to feel comfortable that these are our resources. We all collectively own these things. And more people, we're just going to have more and more people on the landscape. That's just a fact. And Jack Rich, you said this yesterday, change is inevitable. And so part of that change is just more people. And so how do we engage people in a positive and productive way?
Thank you. And then I'd love to actually ask Libby if she had things to contribute, given, again, the same prevalence of communication to the general public about fire and recreation, before we open it up more broadly for questions to the rest of the participants.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I don't know if I really like Nanette's response. I think people they're here, they're going to increase, we're going to have more people using these resources. And so how do we get that connection to people that this is their resource, and how do we build that? And one of the things I often think about is how, like, I mean, I've said it before, but how do we put people in the right experiences that they want? And so a lot of times what happens is folks, they move, they go to places that they know. And so when they're, so, you know, we know that this particular boat launch is popular. And so that's where people go. And so how do we start expanding people's networks of what their recreation opportunities are? How do we get people who are looking for the backcountry experience in the backcountry? How do we get people who want front country in the front country? And that happens regardless if we're talking about invasives, fire, or any of these other ecological challenges. And so I think it's an increased challenge. I like the conversation around how do we start moving away from reactive management to more proactive management and vision setting for what our recreation corridor actually is going to look like. And how do we take into all these ecological components and build that into what our vision is?
That's terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I see there's a number.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I see there's a number of comments in the chat as well that are really echoing and responding to the comments that many of you just made. And I think just with the time, I'd love to open it up to more general questions as well, if others had things that they wanted to throw into the mix.
While we're waiting for that, I'd like to comment that I think one of the issues we have most often in gaps of understanding how recreation impacts things is denial. It's not just a river in Egypt, it's something we all suffer from. We think that everyone else's recreation activities impact more than our own do. And I think we need to reconsider that. It's a bit like the phenomenon of drivers. You know, everybody considers themselves to be a generally good driver, and that they always drive with care and attention and within the boundaries of the law. And it's usually someone else that's a bad driver. So, you know, little infractions like speeding, or even major ones like occasional drinking and driving, well, it's no big deal. I can get away with that today, or it's okay because I'm in a hurry. Statistics tell a different story. And I think that we have to confront the fact that we're all part of the issue. And, you know, admitting that, you know, what is the first step is admitting that we have an issue, and then we can start working on solutions together. And again, I think that's having open conversations with each other as managers, as recreational users, and making sure we remember that those three fingers are pointing back when we start pointing fingers. So let's have a respectful and honest dialogue about these with all stakeholders.
Thanks, Kelly. And we do have one question in our back pocket that actually seems to be an emerging theme of the discussion, both among the panel and then in the chat. So maybe we'll circle back to it. And this is something that Kaitlyn's raised really effectively today. And that's, what are the biggest gaps in our understanding of how recreation interacts with resource conservation? And so I just wanted to throw it open to see if folks had other thoughts they wanted to throw into the mix after a lot of the comments and discussion that have already happened.
I think something that, you know, I think there's a lot of different conversations going on and different sources of knowledge that could probably come together a little more effectively. You know, the kind of work that I'm doing that's like higher level, kind of data driven. But also, you know, we learned this morning, you know, there's so much like local and indigenous deep knowledge of the place and these resources, and, you know, the knowledge of the managers and what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so how do we bring all of these forms of knowledge together? And that might address some of the gaps in our understanding. We're still going to have gaps in our understanding. So I think that, you know, taking conservative approaches where we can to err on the side of caution as things are changing rapidly can help us potentially prevent us from getting up to a point of no return. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Excellent. Nanette.
Yeah, so what's coming up in the chat is these, you know, ideas of how best to approach management and how users could be a tool for getting management goals met. And one part of that is this idea, well, it's not an idea. One part of that is what Mike Oka brought up earlier, and I'd like to bring back around, is ownership of the American Indian or tribal peoples of land, and what is our role in engaging them in management issues and making sure that their treaty rights are considered, that they have sovereign rights, and how do we roll that into at the beginning of a process of management, and then go on to management issues that are related to the recreational type. So, I mean, clearly we have subsistence users, and then we have recreational users, and how do we have those folks on the landscape with all of their needs being met? And it's really, someone said it earlier, a wicked problem, but I don't think it's a problem that we can't get answers to and make strides towards in a collective kind of forums like this.
Thank you, Nanette. That's great. That might be a good place for us to end it. I don't know. Did anyone else have anything that they wanted to say very urgently? Because I feel like that actually might be a good place for us to turn it back over to Dana.